was Chuck shoed and a fruity. He wore a pink t-shirt once.
Well, hi diddly hey, neighborino, tis you, and tis Jim and Phil, and together we make the three interactive constituent parts of this experience, which is going to be our death ranking video. Normally, when I go over a band, I'm not going to rank the albums down like, oh, this one's my favorite, this one, we might tier list some of this shit, but I don't generally think of bands in terms of oh yeah, this is my number one album, my number two, my number three, etc. I do kind of think of them in terms of how I tier out the albums sometimes. But for this one, for circumstances related to the band, I found it easy to just go, oh yeah, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way down to 7. And yeah, so let's jump in with a little introductory note. So, I hearken back to a time when you didn't have your device or your computer that you would get onto to ask, hey Google, tell me about death metal. You might have had the magazines, or you might have seen videos on Beavis and Butthead. I didn't have a whole lot of access to either of those avenues myself. For me, it was much more a proposition of find the sketchy looking dude on the back of the bus and be like, hey, so what's good in death metal? That kind of thing. You find the guys outside the concert, that were willing to talk to a little teenager and be like, so what do you recommend? And that sort of thing. And so there was some contingent circumstances to that. Now, a lot of our guys at the concert were Mexicans, from the DF in particular. So you'd be like, so what's good in death metal? And they'd be like, well, firstly, you need to hear World Downfall. And secondly, you need to just hear Cenotaph. And yeah. And those were both pretty challenging things to just walk into a record store and find at that time, right? And a little fun fact, a lot of these guys had personal experience with Daniel from The Chasm, so that was not a band that they would be initially recommending to us. Shout outs to Luis on that score. And yeah. So a lot of it was, again, just you kind of ask around and what would you get? So they'd toss out names oh well, Sinister, The Crown, Vomitory, etc. Shit of that sort. But at that era, no one was discussing death because it was 1995, and by that point, death was oh yeah, well, people that listen to death metal weren't even talking about that anymore. So that was kind of our backstory with that one. And yeah. Now, I did have this guy that would eventually come in, and Big D and myself, he would talk our ear off about death. He was a musician, and so that was his angle. He was super into the music, and his thing with Chuck was the guy's trying to make the perfect death metal album. So he's just recycling any musician he can find to get to that. And even at that young age, I was I don't approve of that. That doesn't sound like band energy to myself. So that's how I felt about that. And the music often sounded a bit wanky, and I'd be like, I don't know, guy. Kind of a real Megadeth energy there, if you ask me. And we can get to that a little bit anon. We'll just kind of uncover a lot of things, actually, as we go here. So, yeah. Let's begin with, well, first and foremost, Phil's going to actually apply some choppy editing to this one because I have some thoughts, so we may go past our general allotted time. We may make this a series, in fact. We may do Death Part 2, Death Redux, etc. We'll find out as I babble. We'll see what I've got to say. But yeah, that is introductory notes. I am Jim Dempsey, and Phil is Phil Vandervoort, and you are you. And welcome in. Let's get to it. So, we're going to start with part 1. Scream Bloody Gore. You like that? Phil and I reached a good compromise here. I was like, I don't want to do that kind of thing where you chop me up in mid-sentence to edit out pauses and my hemming and hawing so that I here and then there and so forth if I'm elaborating on a thought. I don't like that sort of programming. I want to hear the natural conversational flow of a human being, and I want to produce that. But we've settled on, well, how about you actually just like get to a pause point, and maybe I'll, you know, so we can refocus. So we're discussing Scream Bloody Gore. This is the only time I actually have the disc on hand to whip out. The only other one I have immediate access to via my CD book is Individual Thought Patterns. For reasons I think we discussed in the last portion, I've never cared that much. Now, there was some surprises for me along the way here as we went through this, and I'll discuss a little bit about how we went through this. But Scream Bloody Gore is, of course, like the first Death album, widely regarded as the first death metal album, and I have my opinions about that in my Morbid Angel video, which you can go and watch if you want. It's like this album, rugged and rudimentary, oftentimes selling points for something, but in this case, maybe not. But the thing about the Morbid Angel video, for reasons I've mentioned before, may mention again, is, you know, we're not reshooting that one. But I did say in it that Altars of Madness really is the first death metal album as such. But Scream Bloody Gore, it's a very early album that actually, you know, like has the sounds that we associate to death metal. So, what's Jim's take on it? Now, you know how I did the music reviews, right? I give one for music, one for aesthetic, and one for impact. Well, every death album is going to have a 10 impact for reasons that we can discuss anon. But let's cover those first two. So, Scream Bloody Gore, I rate this at a 3 of 10 on the music, which means I found some enjoyment in it, but not a whole lot. Like, it's not something I'm going to come back to a lot. So yeah, like a fairly low score. It's not like in the 0 didn't enjoy, 1 like barely make the list category, but it's not a very high score. I'd be like, it suffices for Death. I keep it on hand just to remind myself that Death does have albums. Aesthetic score, I rate it at a 7 of 10. The cover is really cool, very appropriate to a death metal album. But when you hear Scream Bloody Gore, you think that there's going to be something like much gorier, right? Some kind of like impetigo kind of gore. And it's not the case. And you understand that they got to water it down to get into a record store, right? But the fact that they got to water it down itself is a reason to mark down on some of the aesthetic score. So yeah, 3 of 10 on the music and 7 of 10 on the aesthetic for Scream Bloody Gore. Well, we'll cover actually a little more of what I thought about Scream Bloody Gore as we discuss other death albums. So, yeah, we move into number 2, Leprosy. Alright, so Leprosy is the first surprise that I got whilst we were covering this discography. I had some preconceived notions about this band, based largely on my, you know, my interpretations of, well, Chuck, and the whole just general energy around the whole project. The first experience I had of Death was this guy that was into music, from a musician's perspective, talking on it, right? And so his big thing was like, the music, and mine was like, well, what's the band energy, right? But I expected to at least enjoy Scream Bloody Gore the most, because I figured, well, it's going to be the most appropriate to the death metal style as I would at least interpret it, right? Like, I know at least it just got wankier and wankier after that, correct? But there was some surprises for me in this discography, and Leprosy was the first one, because I liked it more than Scream Bloody Gore. I was rather surprised by that. Not a lot more, necessarily, but surprisingly more. I think I see why. Well, because at my era, when I was really just first asking people about it, Scream Bloody Gore was not an especially celebrated thing. It was kind of just like a pardoned thing. The people that did talk about death would be like, Leprosy is where it really begins. Scream Bloody Gore was a very rudimentary start, just making a record to get a record out. But Leprosy is where the canon really kicks off and begins in earnest. And that was the way that death bands seemed to think of it at the time, right? So I do see that vibe. I'd be like, okay, yeah, it's a step up from Scream Bloody Gore in a lot of respects. There's still a certain amount of the same feral energy, but it's a little more focused. Only a little more focused. But I would slot this between a 3 and a 4 out of 10 on the music. Now on aesthetic, I give this one a good 10 out of 10. Because I like the successive replica cover thing that they got going. But this one really just hits in with the theme of it here. And also it's a nice, bold illustration. It just kind of sticks out like, hey, look at this. Here's some unsettling heavy metal for you. And at this point in history, the impact, of course, is greatly diminished. But, you know, even in the 90s, like, that was kind of a startling thing to just see on a record cover relative to what you would be seeing on most things in a record store. And it's a nice, bold palette, and fairly well executed. It's got a very evocative sense, so I really dig it as an image. So yeah, I give that one a 10 on aesthetic. The band photo, you know, it's like ugly dudes in blue jeans, and that's the thing. I'd really like to pinpoint the era, and it wouldn't necessarily be a specific year, but the 5-year period, the window wherein guys were wearing blue jeans because blue jeans were primarily what jeans were, and black jeans were not really a thing. And when guys were wearing blue jeans to signify, like, we are doing this intentionally to harken back to the era wear, right? But we can do that later when we shit on Andrew Lee. Yet some more. Let's get back to this topic. So, yeah, it's still 3 out of 10 with music, but stronger 3, because it's slotting up to a potential 4, and the aesthetic definitely a lot stronger on this album. And yeah, this was the first of some surprises here. I like this more than Scream Bloody Gore. And so this was the first one where, just as I was listening through them sequentially to get the feel for doing this video, I said, wow, this one's knocking Scream Bloody Gore down a peg. And, well, we'll cover some more of that as we get further on, because now we're going on to spiritual healing. So spiritual healing was not as much of a surprise as Leprosy for me. I listened to this one and I was like, I heard this one actually back in the day. I think more than I heard Leprosy, because someone that I knew had this one. Whereas anyone that I knew that had Leprosy, like, I was never over at their house, right? So this one, I was like, well, it's about as wank as I remember it. Kind of in that, if you compare Megadeth to Metallica, the big reason why Megadeth was never as big as Metallica, the 2 big reasons are, number 2, because Dave is a wily motherfucker and the guys from Metallica are marketable motherfuckers, but number 1 is because Lars Ulrich knows how to fashion a song. You know why he's got the songwriting credits with James is because he's certainly the one in that band that's taming everything down, being like, hey, make this, like, just make that a song, right? Like, that band boils down to James's ability to play guitar and Lars's ability to hear a song. And that is my contention of Metallica. With, granted, a lot of context missing, because I stopped listening to that shit a long time ago. But I think that suffices a lot for their relevant albums. And, there's a lot of that kind of just, where the fuck are you going here element with death. And that, I hear that, like, when I listen to Megadeth, because I know you're saying to yourself, like, bro, where the fuck are you going here? Well, this is where I'm going. Metallica's just got a very streamlined sense of a song, and Obituary similarly had that same sense of a song. So when I was comparing Death to the other three bands, and I said, well, it's not as mean as Deicide, it's not as massive as Morbid Angel, it's not as focused as Obituary. I mean, I stopped listening to Obituary years ago too, but their relevant albums, like, they harken on an idea. And that was actually kind of a standout for Obituary, because at that point in time, like, every band was just every which way with every fucking song. I think I threw Immolation out maybe earlier. Like, Immolation, Suffocation, a lot of bands like that had that kind of issue where you'd be like, alright, so you got about 1,000 ideas here, and you could just draw out, like, 5 of those and make them, like, a more comprehensible song here. And then there's the case where your riffs just themselves go, like, 1,000 different directions that are kind of needless. And so that's where, like, Death is just wank atop even Megadeth, where I'd be like, what the fuck are we doing here? So, again, not a surprise for me, really. In terms of the music, I'd be like, 1 to 2 of 10. Like, I didn't hate it, but this is definitely not the kind of thing that I would reach for. Even if I was wanting to listen to Death, this is not an album I'd reach for. So very low on the musical score, but another 10 on the aesthetic. The cover here, I really like the succession with the replica things, and I especially like that they've got the pink and then the blue. So that whole thematic continuity thing really does appeal to me. And it, again, fits really well with the theme of just the album being presented. And, you know, like, here's some rudimentary, ugly motherfuckers cranking out an album. I presume in 1989 or what have you, or 1990, it was just another album, but you look back with even a few years context from like 1995 or 94, and you'd be like, oh yeah, so these guys are all, you know, foundational bands just filtered through this band, okay. So it's like the training camp for bands that are actually a lot better than this band. But, yeah. I did really like the cover art, and that is my assessment of Spiritual Healing. One of the more disappointing ones for me. So yeah, a weak 2 of 10 on the music, but a firm 10 of 10 on the aesthetic. And that will take us into... Shit, what is the next one? I gotta check my notes here. I think we're doing Human next. So Human was the second really big surprise for me out of this catalog. I actually enjoyed this album a lot more than I expected to. Maybe there was some chemistry going between Chuck and the boys, you might say. But one thing I noticed is this one is the most focused yet. Like, just specifically focused. Compare this one to Spiritual Healing, and the songs are, like, much shorter on average, and I would dare say, like, a bit, yeah, more just direct and immediate. This one was the one I enjoyed the most, and the most unexpectedly, because if Leprosy, I was like, wow, I like this more than Scream Bloody Gore. I wasn't necessarily excessively surprised by that fact. I was quite surprised by how much I enjoyed Human. So, now, that said, I don't get the whole thing with focus and So it might be interesting to hear those lost focus versions, assuming they even exist anywhere. But maybe it's better if they don't. Maybe it's just something that can't even live up to the expectations. I've never actually followed up with that. So feel free to drop a comment correcting me on if I could just be logging on to YouTube and finding out what focus would have sounded like. I've never actually followed up with that question. Because yeah, again, like this was the first time I really dug into death far enough to hear like, oh shit, humans a lot better than I expected. So I rate this one. With the music, I give this one a solid 4 and potentially up to a 5. I'd be like, there's a lot of things on this one that I would potentially listen back to. Now, aesthetic score, this was a big drop-off for Death. It's a shitty album cover. Even for a death metal album. Even for like, just as an image. I'd be like, nah. I can't go a whole lot better than a 4 on that. And I feel like I might even be reaching it. That's kind of an abysmal one. So, an interesting turnaround. Surprisingly good with the music. And when I say surprisingly good, I don't mean like, oh wow, I found this to be really good. I just mean like, wow, I found this to be a lot better than I was expecting. Because I was expecting to be like, I can drop a lot of these off in the 0 and 1 terrain. And this one was one of the first times where I was like, wow, that's fucking standout shit. Relative to what I was expecting. Still not excessively down with the vocals. But I feel like I can't comment with a whole lot of knowledge on where this stands in how the death canon is perceived today, actually. It seems like this one does get a fair amount of coverage. So yeah, maybe I agree that it's deserved. And yeah, that'll bring us into our next one. Individual thought patterns. Individual thought patterns I can knock out relatively quickly. This one is actually the one I was probably most familiar with, besides Scream Bloody Gore. This one was the one I was most initially familiar with and kind of formed my general ideas of death. Because the guy that was, bending our ear about death, he had all of the albums. And Big D particularly liked the song Jealousy for the bwah, 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 fretless bass. I think this one was probably a big one because if my information is correct, and I'm basing this off of memory here, they had a video on Beavis and Butthead from this album. But yeah, so it was my first impression, and I'd said at the time, that's very technical, and it was kind of my first realization as a youngster that technical wasn't necessarily the direction that I wanted to hear out of death metal. Because I had gotten into metal, like listening to first Sabbath and then Maiden, and then thinking from the Maiden, like, oh snaps, like those bright harmonies, those very technical sorts of the music. Like, that's the kind of thing that makes some good metal, right? And if you're just playing rudimentary basic riffs, that's more punk rock kind of thing, right? So then I was confronted with death, and it was my first, it was kind of a curb stomping for a youngster in that regard of expectations. But going back to it, this does meet with my expectations. I'm like, tolerable. I'd give it in the 2 to 3 range for music, because it's definitely not something I reach back for specifically, even again when listening for death. Nowhere near as strong as Human in that regard. Maybe, again, it's just some of that nudge chemistry that Chuck had with the guys from Cynic, but I didn't feel it with this one. So I rated this one as, 2 to 3 out of 10 with the music. And then the aesthetic, well, it's a much better cover than Human. And so if we're going into a new era of death covers, I'd be like, well, this is a much stronger, this is like the Leprosy to a Scream Bloody Gore in terms of presenting a new artistic front. I give it a between a 7 and an 8, because as a death metal album cover, I'd be like, that's a 6. But as like something that you would just have like as a piece of art on your wall, like that could be a good 9. So yeah, it balances between those two. I actually really like it as an image. For death metal covers, this is getting a little dubious. But it's an interesting score, so yeah. It's lower in the music range, but I'm digging on this aesthetic here with this new idea. And then we're going into symbolic. So this one is the last big surprise for me. This was also the last one that was like just kind of like in the background, because by the time Sounds of Perseverance was coming out, we had a guy bending our ear about death. But symbolic was, I think, it was regarded as like a turning point by a lot of people, which once I finally got the whole catalog straight, I was always confused by that. I think I conflated symbolic and human, and was like, oh, so symbolic was the one where they like went from being death metal-y to being like super wanky, right? But no, like actually, that would have been, technically that would have been spiritual healing for all I care, but it really would have been human, I suppose. And then symbolic is, according to the internet notes, where it shifted from being technical death metal to being more melodic death metal. And I'd be like, well, either way, honestly, as selling points, neither one appeals to me. But I did pluck a big surprise out of this one. If human and leprosy vie for what I would actually regard as probably my favorite death metal albums, or death albums, that is, nowhere near death metal albums, mind you, just death albums, then Symbolic itself is probably my favorite song by the band. And so generally when someone's talking about death, they'll be running down the litany of all the big songs like Pull the Plug and Open Casket and shit, whatever else the other ones are. This one has Crystal Mountain on it, I noted. But my impression was it never really lives up quite to that first song. And even the first song, it's really kind of just, I think it is my favorite death song because it's got a couple of really strong riffs. It opens with one, it closes with one, but in between it goes too damn many places, and you're just kind of like, alright, could you like condense this down just a little bit? And that is really a good summary of like death overall, in my opinion. It's like, yeah, well, there's good ideas in there, but there's a disproportionate amount of ideas that aren't good relative to any other death metal that I could be listening to at this time. And by this time, not necessarily any other death metal, but at the time, you know, you'd be comparing it to a lot less different shit. And, well, yeah, just a lot of the it was too much for me, so. But that said, I did really kind of seize on elements of this and be like, this is a listenable one. And I rate this one higher, again, than expected. So this one is, again, 4 to 5 territory for me. Similar to Human, in terms of like, oh, I'd actually come back to this and find this more listenable. And, aesthetic value, again, steps up significantly. At this point, I'd be like, well, the band photos, the layout, and all that shit, like, it's just going off the rails for death metal. But, that said, the cover itself, we're just judging on that here for these purposes. I do really think that's one of the better ones. And this one gets, well, I just give it 2 separate scores, because as a death metal album, it's a lot better than Individual Thought Patterns. So I'd be like, well, it goes from a 4 up to a 6, did I say? up to a 7. But as an image for like just something that you would have on the wall, it goes from a 9 up to a 10. It is a lot cooler. I really like the whole Blood of Eden kind of energy they got going there. So yeah, stronger than individual thought patterns, potentially stronger than human. I'm kind of like honestly debating on it and just improvising in the moment here, but the 3 standouts that really took me aback, the big surprises were, in order of how surprising they were also, leprosy and human and symbolic. This one I'd be like, I did enjoy this a lot more than I expected. And that's going to bring us to our final chapter here in the death ranking. Sound of Perseverance. Are you still watching? Then this one is dedicated to you, perseverant viewer. And now my eternal and forever impression of Sound of Perseverance is always going to boil down to the thought, the kind of ironic thought, that one riff in Spirit Crusher is that one riff in Ride the Lightning. Ironic because Death really is one of those bands, Chuck really was one of those musicians where you totally have that whole thing about that guy has an individual voice to his riffs. But yeah, just that's the first thing I thought about individual thought patterns and will forever think whenever that album is brought up. Second one I think, just my immediate thought is, what a stupid album cover. I divide the Death catalog into 3 distinct chapters, essentially, where you've got the Repka era. It's a recognizable death metal band, or, various incarnations thereof, but they're recognizable death metal records as such. And then the next 3 albums kind of form an era where it's more like something you might find in a poster store for the album cover, and the music is like reaching much more towards a not necessarily marketable, but a more mainstream, as such, like heavy metal kind of direction. And then finally you would toss in that last album as its own kind of individual thing, an individual thought pattern, dare I say. And I would slot in that last album with the Control Denied album, because there's no real band continuity besides Chuck himself between most of these albums, and the last one is definitely the most distinct and least death metal of them all. At that point, it's just really like, yeah, he's trying to make a contemporary heavy metal record, and doing what he can with what he's got, and then from there he'd parlay it into a different thing where he's got like an actual singer, right? So, my thoughts on this album, 0 to 1 on the enjoyment. I don't really regard much of this album. In fact, it kind of irritates me. And aesthetic, pretty much a ditto, like just a really stupid album cover. Today actually was the first time when I realized, oh, there's people on that mountain. But in general, my usual thought is just like, this album is so boring, even the cover art is having a good yawn. Like, but that aside, what the fuck am I looking at here with that? It's just really garishly stupid as an artistic piece. So yeah, I can't go very high on that one. Maybe in the 1 to 2 range, but I just don't have a lot to say about this album. I don't really think much about it. I'd be like, that's the end of Death, a band that I didn't think a lot about anyways. And yeah, like, that is Sound of Perseverance. That is, though, in my opinion, the absolute most banger of titles that they have going. Even if you throw in, like, things like the first 3, I'd be like, Sound of Perseverance is a really cool, it's a good title. And especially given, probably assumed that the guy had some idea that at least he was, had some illness going by this point, because that was 1998, right? Like, dude died by 2001. Mind you, I know brain cancer can go really fast, but just a thought about it. one way or another, it's got that nice David Bowie kind of tinge to it. But that's all I've got to say about it. It's just, it's a cool album title. So let's give a quick ranking. I looked at my initial rank, and I can see my own preconceived notions dripping all over this. I actually ranked them 1 to 7 initially, going Scream Bloody Gore, to Human, to Leprosy, to... what's next then? To this one? Sound of Perseverance? Wow. Down to Individual Thought Patterns, to Symbolic, to Spiritual Healing. Well, I was going off of the very initial list, and I was kind of rifling through the notes. This is actually the authoritative Jim Dempsey ranking of Death albums 1 to 7. I rank them as Human, to Leprosy, to Symbolic, 1, 2, 3. And then from there, I'd be like, okay, Scream Bloody Gore actually comes in at a surprising number 4, which puts... what are we left here with? Which puts Individual Thought Patterns at number 5, as I correctly assessed it. No, I'm sorry, that would put it at number 6. Because I liked Symbolic more than that. So, Symbolic edged out Individual Thought Patterns, and Sound of Perseverance came in dead last. I don't know why I would have given this a 4. Like, I wrote a lot of different iterations of notes. I might have actually been thinking of something else besides the rankings here when I wrote this initial one, but I can't imagine what else I thought it was. Suffice to say, to quickly recap my impressions of Death as a longtime death metal fan and longtime disdainer of Death themselves, himself, what have you, I was surprised to find Scream Bloody Gore notched out by the albums Leprosy, Human, and to a certain extent Symbolic, and so I would rate those as upper tier Death albums, and Individual Thought Patterns and Sound of Perseverance and Spiritual Healing all met my expectations quite firmly. So maybe I appreciate those albums the most of all Death albums for not making me look like an ass. But, I think we did a pretty good job of that, right? I gave you a good, solid review on that, and Phil will do the math and we'll actually slot numbers out. Mind you, they're going to be distorted numbers. We're entering them into the Dempsey Hall with the mathematical numbers that they get, but they're going to be skewed upwards because Death is such a significant band, and I'm giving some actual weight to the impact that each one has. But I didn't like them as much as those numbers will indicate. And that's going to be our review of the Death albums. So, thank you for sticking with us all the way through. We'll see you next time when we do probably either Obituary or Deicide, because we've got a theme going of the big 4 to 4 here, and stay tuned for Obituary, because whether or not you enjoy this one, that one will be some epic work. Jim promises. Meantime, once again, you've just spent a significant portion of your day with Jim and Phil. We'll buy you flowers if you give us your good mailing address in the comments. Dempsey, be dips.